he already understood his next step and why he had actually asked the Emperor about this. Without saying a word, he suddenly pushed off and jumped straight down, where he was immediately engulfed and drawn inside by liquid hot flames. At the end, he managed to shout for his wife not to worry, and to live a decent, happy life with their little son. It was hard to believe, but he really did jump down, and for the first time in his life the Emperor saw such a desperate act. In fact, he tempered the magic sword with his own energy, and to do this, he had to burn his body in a boiling cauldron. This was the act of a great alchemist, and it is difficult to imagine what torments the brave blacksmith had to endure for this. The Emperor bitterly regretted that, because of him, the best alchemist of the empire burned alive, although before his death he managed to leave his main legacy. That same day, upon learning of this, his wife directly asked her son if he wanted to avenge his father's death. Shedding tears, the boy was ready to do this, although he knew how difficult it would be to pierce the ruler's body, protected by magic. The woman then took the bundle containing the second forged magic sword, which was now supposed to belong to this young man. Looking at the cauldron where her husband forged iron, she briefly told her son the story of his father's legacy, which the boy was obliged to know. The blood and flesh of thousands of people is more valuable than their 2 lives. But if they sacrifice to the sword, killing the Emperor will be much easier. And then the boy saw his mother jump up and rush towards the cauldron, in which the fire had been burning for a long time. This woman did the same as her husband in the morning, imbuing the sword with her energy and sacrificing herself. And now her son was obliged to fulfill the destiny for which his parents had sacrificed their own lives. Looking at the magic blade, he understood that it contained his mother's soul, and with this power, he definitely had no right to fail in his attack on the Emperor. He wanted to avenge the death of his parents at all costs, and was ready to die in this bloody duel if necessary. After this, the 16-year-old youth, taking the blade, entered the palace alone, and no one was able to repel a single attack from him. Having finally reached the main culprit of his troubles, he plunged the blade straight into his chest, knowing that he would definitely not have time to dodge. When the battle was over, the swords disappeared, as if they had never been there, and the guy holding the 2 magic balls was now their sole owner. This means that now he has access to sacred relics with the souls of ancient heroes, and with their strength and help, he is unlikely to lose this battle. Taking one last look at his opponent before attacking, he saw in a new light the monster that had seemed invincible just recently. Mentally addressing his ancestors, he asked them to allow him to take their greatest dreams and desires and fulfill them right now. He then swore that as long as he lived, no dark magician would win and no monsters would be able to enslave humanity. It seemed that Richard already deeply regretted listening to Edward and drinking the monster's blood, dooming himself to death in this duel. He was not mistaken, because having gained such strength, Henry began to move 10 times faster than before, although he was very fast before. Now he had 2 magical artifacts in his hands at once, and the light energy and the dark energy merged into one single blow. It was unlikely that the dark energy barrier that Richard was used to using could help him, and he would soon suffer the same fate as the ancient emperor. The guy seemed to feel like he was in the place of that boy, for whose victory his parents sacrificed themselves and gave him the most precious thing. After the first blow, Richard flew far to the side and understood how this battle would end for him. But he himself challenged this guy to a mortal fight. But he wouldn't have done it if he had known who he really was. It seemed impossible. But Henry now controlled not only the elements from the balls, but also the main relics that all the clans were hunting for. It's unlikely that the mutant expected this before the fight, because it was as if it wasn't a student rushing towards him, but a real storm, ready to demolish everything around. Instead of a shield, the monster held out the blade given to him by Edward before the fight, hoping to defend himself with it. But as soon as the tip of Henry's sword touched this blade, a crack immediately appeared on its edge. It became clear that the sacred relic in the guy's hands was much stronger than any, even the most durable steel. Then the guy delivered a second blow with all his might and cut through the enemy's weapon, leaving a deep crack on it. Henry knew that the dark force that fed the monster with energy would resist to the last, but he was ready for anything. It was incredible. But the boy that the immortal spirit met in the Hall of Souls had now become a true warrior without equal. With a whole series of powerful blows, Henry tried to destroy the main magical weapon with which the monster fought. Richard understood what this puppy was up to, and without a blade, he definitely wouldn't win this fight. Finally, noticing the deepest crack on the blade of the sword, the boy aimed exactly there to deliver his final blow. At the last second, Richard asked him not to do this, because by destroying the blade, he would kill him too, and he would not be reborn. But it was too late. because the guy's speed had reached its limit, and it was unlikely that it would be possible to stop him at the moment to which he had been moving for so long. And finally, the blade was cut off from the mutant's magical weapon, and it became clear that the end of the battle was closer than one might think. At the same time, near the estate, everyone was waiting for the end of the duel and hoping that Henry would be able to defeat his main enemy. Aurora, still holding the artifact, suddenly noticed that the circle surrounding them had disappeared, meaning that Richard's magic had somehow weakened. She realized that the battle had come to an end, but it was still unclear who had won it. At that very moment, the fight between Logan and the old man who led the fighters on Richard's side ended. The old man was finally defeated, and lying on the stone square, no longer showed any signs of life. Luckily, Logan's magic turned out to be very successful for combat tactics, and it's good that the guy used it correctly. Now everything depended only on Henry, because if he lost the fight, all their efforts would be in vain. Suddenly the old man looked at the young warrior and said that Richard was not so easy to defeat. It was unlikely that he would lose to a student, but he should have thought carefully before saying such a thing, because the stupid old man simply didn't know who Henry really was all this time. Soon he was to see with his own eyes the figure of the one who had won this mortal duel on the porch of the estate. And although Richard was the first to leave the estate, his entire body was so lacerated by the blade that it was unlikely that anyone would have survived such wounds. The girls immediately realized from his gait that he was not a winner at all, but was barely moving, still hoping to leave here in one piece. But running was useless and unable to stay on his feet. This warrior, who for some reason had made a pact with the darkness, began to slowly sink. Now there was no doubt who had won the mortal combat, and the old man had to change his mind about Henry. Then everyone saw how the mutant collapsed on the square, and next to him lay his sword cut in half. Immediately after this, Henry appeared on the threshold of the house and announced that this duel could be considered over. A second later, he began to change appearance again, and everyone saw the familiar face of the alchemist, who would forever go down in the history of the academy. There were 2 marks on his hands, and it became clear to everyone that the ancient deities, who were once people, entrusted him with the salvation of all mankind. Until recently, many considered Henry a simple loser, but now they realized how wrong they were all this time. And just a second later, all of the guy's friends screamed loudly with joy, celebrating his victory and being proud of their new leader. One of the first to run out to meet him was Sophia, who hugged her boyfriend tightly and was happy to see him alive. Henry told her in a quiet voice that he had promised to return victorious from this meat grinder, and was glad that he had been able to keep his word. At that moment, Sophia saw another girl in the crowd, looking at Henry with the look that lovers usually look at. It seems that after this victory, the guy will become even more famous and popular among girls, and Sophia will worry more often when he is not at home. Today was clearly his day, and all his friends were loudly rejoicing, because it was no coincidence that each of them considered this guy an example for themselves. Those fighters who initially fought for Richard's family had a hard time believing that this guy was the genius everyone was talking about. Logan walked up to him, punched him in the chest in a friendly manner, and said that he never doubted his talent for a second. Of all the older members of the family, the only one left was the bald old man who was still writhing in the square after the battle with Logan. And no matter how Henry treated him, the old man alone was able to take responsibility for the lives of the others, which is what the boy asked him to do. But the head was dead, and that meant the old man could do what he thought was necessary, especially since this genius himself gave him the right to manage affairs. Shedding tears, he suddenly loudly declared that from that day on, his family's relations with all other clans would change forever. He swore that no one would ever be Henry's enemy again, and that all that stupidity like blood feud was a thing of the past. Of course, the guy was immediately thrown into the air, and Henry only hoped that he would not be accidentally dropped on the way back to the ground. One could say that this was his finest hour, because everyone in one voice loudly shouted his name, calling him the most outstanding warrior of the Empire. But at that moment he suddenly had a vision from the past, and Henry understood that the main hour of the test was still ahead. After all, on that day, nothing foreshadowed the invasion of mutants and the hellish fire that they caused in the capital. And those guys who were celebrating their common victory with him right now were brutally killed, and he personally saw their cold corpses. All the people he loved and spent so much time with were killed, and then their bodies burned in hellfire. Back in reality, he looked around at the moment when Ralph advised Henry to gather the students of the academy and give them at least a lesson in magic. But right now he had to finish the job, because Richard was still writhing in pain, living out his last minutes of life. As he approached him, he realized that this man had simply chosen the wrong path. Otherwise, his life could have turned out completely differently. Next to him was the cursed blood of the monster that he had drunk to gain his power. What happened in the past life should not happen again, and Henry was ready to do anything to avoid seeing that tragedy at the academy a second time. And this victory was only the first step towards Henry's goal, and the guy was glad that he was able to defeat such a formidable warrior. Meanwhile, back in the building, Julia couldn't contain her joy as she received a message about Henry's victory. Who would have thought that this boy would cope with Charlie's family alone? But Michelle understood that someone helped him. Turning around suddenly, she felt a powerful aura rapidly approaching from the very direction where Richard's estate was. Without further ado, she suddenly jumped out of the window, smashing the glass into small pieces with her body, and intended to get there as quickly as possible. She had a great ability to sense things, because the dark aura of the creature she had noticed suddenly appeared behind Henry. Both of the guy's spiritual assistants also saw this creature, but they understood that they had never met such a powerful dark magician before. Henry immediately felt the familiar disgusting smell, as if it had eaten into the bone marrow, which he remembered from his first life. It felt like this creature smelled like death itself, as the smell of decomposing corpses could be felt even 10 miles away. It was the ancestor who attacked the capital in a past life, and the creature appeared here immediately after Richard's death in a duel. However, for some reason the guy did not move from his place, and his assistants shielded Henry, ordering him to run immediately, but none of them were able to resist the dark energy that descended from above, and which this dark creature possessed. The guy didn't even need to turn around to recognize that familiar aura that he would never forget, and that always brought only death. On that last day when he saw his loved ones alive, he, forgetting about everything, ran through the crowd, trying to find them. But when he saw Sophia, she was already dead, and that is how he remembered their last tragic meeting. And above all this towered a monster whose level of strength surpassed any of Henry's opponents and was impossible to defeat. This monster managed to grab Julia, who sacrificed herself that day to save the inhabitants of the capital. But as punishment for this insolence, the monster squeezed his fist in one movement and blood sprayed in all directions. This terrible sight had always appeared to the guy in terrible nightmares, but now he had to see everything with his own eyes. It was hard to hold back the fear at the sight of this creature, but it was even harder to hold back the tears because all his loved ones were killed in a matter of minutes. And this giant continued to stand in place and tracked down his next victim in the crowd of fleeing people. And right now, the monster that sent that giant to the ground was very close to Henry. He jumped towards him with such speed that even the space around him was distorted, and it became clear that he was now at the peak of his abilities. But even with such force, the mutant easily stopped the guy and, grabbing him by the throat, looked straight into his eyes. Instead of a face and under the hood, this monster had only a black abyss visible, and the mutant considered people to be of a lower class, subject to destruction. The worst part was that Henry had lost a lot of strength in the fight with Richard, and couldn't fully use his mana right now. Perhaps the creature had chosen the time to attack specifically, and the duel with Richard was just part of its deliberate plan. However, Henry had one powerful ability left in reserve, but the energy would only be enough for one single blow. Suddenly turning to the side, the guy realized that all this time they were not alone here, and another person was ready to fight side by side with him. It was hard to believe, but among the teachers of the academy, there was one powerful warrior who didn't look like that at all on the outside. It was Michelle who was the first to sense the monster's ominous aura, and immediately went here to meet him face to face. She knew perfectly well what this mutant was and asked the guy to calm down because now she was taking over the case. Seeing Richard's corpse, Michelle realized that this guy had single-handedly defeated a formidable enemy, and they finally had a chance to stop the invasion, although the boy remained in the creature's strong grip. With Michelle's help, the forces in this fight were equalized. This girl had a fire dragon as her spiritual mentor, comparable in strength to 100 giant mutants. Seeing her from afar, the immortal spirit couldn't believe his eyes, because this simple teacher had been hiding her true face the entire time. Yes, Skyfox had to admit that this woman was the strongest fire master she had ever met. Even Julia saw her aunt in all her glory for the first time, and could not believe that she had been hiding the truth from her all this time. This flame, emitting a fiery dragon, was capable of burning everything around, and even the dark creature recognized Michelle as a serious rival. But a spark that can only flare up once is useless, even if it shines brighter than anything else in the world. However, one time was enough to destroy the vile creature, and the girl directed all her energy towards it. Walking up to Richard, he calmly placed his hand on his back, ready to easily block Michelle's blow. And the next second, a fiery whirlwind began to swirl in that place, and gradually the creature, along with Richard's corpse, began to dissolve into the air. And Michelle, who was attacking, suddenly realized that she had missed a blow, because this monster was much stronger than she could have imagined. No one saw where exactly he managed to attack from, but now it didn't matter, because Michelle was flying from a height down to the ground. At the last moment, Julia saw her aunt, who was about to fall to the ground in a second, but still made a last attempt to save her. Luckily, she made it, and instead of crashing into the stone square, Michelle fell straight into Julia's arms. It turned out that the girl was currently under a spell that left terrible black marks all over her body, and it seemed that the creature was able to activate this magic at will. Looking at her from afar, Henry realized that she had experienced an adverse reaction after consuming the cursed blood, and there was no doubt where she had contracted the disease. It turned out that she also decided to drink the same blood as Richard, but did not understand who advised the girl to do this. However, now it didn't matter anymore, because she felt so bad, as if she was living out her last minutes and she urgently needed to come up with something. Without saying a word, Henry suddenly walked up to Julia and picked up Michelle, although Julia didn't understand what he was planning. But as he left, he asked her to just do whatever he said and not ask unnecessary questions if she still wanted to see her aunt alive. Soon, he laid her down on a large, soft bed and realized that he was ready to fulfill his next destiny. Finally, he closed the door tightly and asked the immortal spirit not to enter the room until Henry gave him permission. Then he suddenly asked Julia to take off all of her aunt's outerwear, adding that she would have to take off her underwear too. Of course, she had a lot of questions, but there was no time for explanations and it was worth just listening to this guy. It seemed she could have expected anything but this. Although Michelle was already dying, and there was no point in paying attention to details. Soon, Julia had stripped Michelle naked, and all over her body were visible those very spots of infection that could have brought her to the grave. If it had been anyone else in her place, he would have become a corpse long ago, because the poison had spread throughout the body and should have killed the carrier. But the boy was determined to prevent this, and activating the energy of restoration, directed all his power at his teacher. Michelle immediately felt a surge of vitality that the student was giving her, but the unbearable pain immediately made her scream loudly. But then, to Julia's horror, Henry began to direct magic to parts of her body that were not intended for the eyes of strangers. Now the immortal spirit understood why Henry asked him to leave, and why Julia was so loudly asking him not to touch her aunt everywhere. Unable to bear this sight, the girl ran out of the room with a loud scream, unable to bear this abomination any longer. As a result, the immortal spirit felt the power of this girl, because when she opened the door with all her might, she did not know that he was standing right behind this door. Soon everything was finally over and silence reigned in the estate where Henry was performing the ritual. Michelle had to endure such wild pain that after it, she sat silently in place for a long time, without saying a word. Then she finally asked how the guy managed to suppress the poison, and he replied that he had to completely absorb it from her body. It was the most serious infection Henry had ever seen in his life, and it was hard to imagine how it would have ended if he hadn't been there. But it's possible that some of the poison still remains in Michelle's blood, and they will have to repeat the procedure later. But Julia couldn't understand how her aunt's body ended up with poison that could only belong to the Dark Clan. To kill the demon, Michelle had to take the cursed blood, but it consumed her body more and more every day. Suddenly, Michelle noticed with a smile that when the guy undressed her for the ceremony, for some reason she did not see any embarrassment on his face, and then she seriously asked the guy what to expect from the poison and how long she had left to live in this world. He honestly admitted that if she used force even once, the poison would spread faster. If the poison fills half of her body, the process will become irreversible, and the monster inside her will take over her mind forever. Although in 3 years Henry's powers could grow significantly, and then she would have a small chance of survival. Julia fell to her knees in tears, realizing that these might be her last years of communication with Michelle. But Michelle immediately rushed to calm her down, because Henry's level was growing very quickly, and they still had hope for salvation. Looking at the girls, Henry understood that now he had to not only stop the mutants, but also save the life of his teacher. In the past life, all the cultivators united, but they had almost no chance of winning on that terrible day. Most likely, it was Michelle who was the brave woman who killed the demon, but died from the cursed blood. To prevent this from happening again, Henry needs to quickly develop his abilities to the limit in order to save humanity and Michelle's life. Julia was ready to do anything to find an antidote for her aunt, and was even willing to sacrifice her life for this. But at that moment, the guy put his hand on her shoulder and asked her to forget about the war with mutants, at least for a little while. After all, at this rate, Michelle might not get married, and this remark caused such a storm of emotions in her that the guy regretted his words. In the end, Julia had to defend her aunt, because she could not allow the young man to judge a woman who had already seen a lot in life. Although, instead of stupid conversations, the girls should have first told him what other secrets he didn't know about them. For example, why does a simple teacher and head of the committee know more about the cursed blood than he does? Although Michelle also had questions for the guy who recently showed a technique that no ordinary person could master. They ended up standing opposite each other, looking into each other's eyes with suspicion, as if each was hiding too much from the other. Only Henry could completely heal Michelle, but in return he asked her for one favor. Now was not the time to hide the truth, and the guy asked her to be honest and tell everything as it was. The guy had long guessed their identities and understood that the purpose of their arrival in the capital was not at all to work at the academy. Realizing the futility of her secrecy in front of her friends, Michelle declared that she was the first advisor to the Pavilion Elder and had come here to look for the sacred blade. The encounter with the demon strengthened her confidence that the blade was hidden somewhere here, and it was no coincidence that the monster appeared so often in these places. Then Julia realized that there was no point in her hiding her identity either, especially since Michelle had already done it before her. In fact, she was the head of the pavilion, the daughter of an elder, who had been living all this time under the guise of an ordinary student. After that, the guy thought hard, because if this was true, all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. The demon attack in his past life was not an accident, and now Julia has become the one who once saved his life by standing between him and the demon's messenger. The giant monster probably attacked the academy because the sacred blade was somewhere within its walls, but he never found the relic. Suddenly, Julia declared that she had always liked the guy's rebellious outlook on the world, and asked him not to change his attitude towards her. However, he did not listen to her and stated that the demon had found nothing, and that he now had much more information than one could even imagine. Now, to prevent tragedy, we need to find the sword faster than the demon, and it would be best to unite the efforts of all clans for this. And then, taking out the magic elixir, he said that it was no accident that he had so quickly learned alchemy and the art of healing. In his hands was the source of all existence, and if the girls thought about it, they would understand that he was telling the truth. But Julia's expression showed that she had never heard such nonsense and did not understand what Henry meant. However, there was meaning in the guy's words, and the immortal spirit believed that after everything that had happened, it was worth listening more carefully to Henry. In ancient times, the Empress could not bear the mass extinction of people, and, taking the blank of a sword, went alone to the palace of God. It was then that she caught the eye of the immortal spirit, holding her sword in her hands and trying to tell him her story. Yes, this heroic woman protected the entire human race from generation to generation, endlessly being reborn in different guises. And then, during the era of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, one of the warriors led an army of demons, wielding that same sacred blade. People did not know the warrior's real name, so they began to call him by the name of the blade itself, and that is what the guy is called to this day. It is difficult to imagine the strength of this man, but it was the sacred relic that helped him remain unnoticed, and no one could recognize him as a monster. It was just strange that this woman, who had been reborn in different guises, had not yet appeared and made herself known. It seemed that the immortal spirit had started to talk a bit and began to discuss various girls who could probably hold the essence of this woman. Meanwhile, in the dark palace where the creature from another world lived, events unfolded that Edward could not even imagine. After all, the last battle, before which he persuaded Richard to drink the cursed blood, turned into a catastrophe for him that could no longer be avoided. Now the guy himself looked like a monster, which a member of his family had recently become, and he himself had become a guinea pig in the hands of a dark creature. Of course, he knew perfectly well what his transformation would lead to, but more than anything in the world, he did not want to be this walking dead man. His father saw with his own eyes what Edward was turning into and could not understand why the creature chose him. However, in response, he heard that Edward was strong enough for this, and that his whole life, since childhood, he had been prepared for one and only role. It was he who was supposed to become the person who would transform into a mutant and lead the invasion of the Empire's capital. But no matter how much Edward wanted revenge on Henry, he would never agree to become a puppet of a dark creature and live his life so worthlessly. Suddenly, his father declared that Edward should not forget how his mother died and what he owed to her and his entire family. At these words, the boy suddenly stopped, not understanding what exactly his father was saying and what mission he had in mind. At that moment, he suddenly remembered a scene from his childhood when he and Henry met after Henry was beaten up by street kids. At some point, Edward completely lost pity for his former friend, because he could not stand the manifestation of weakness in difficult moments of life. However, he was not going to allow those bastards who deserved to die to bully other people. That same day, finding his father in the garden, he declared that he had understood a lot recently and now knew exactly what he wanted. To protect his friends, he needed the strength to defeat multiple opponents at once, even if they were older. It was clear from the father's smile that the man had been waiting for such a conversation with his son for a long time, and he ordered Edward to go with him. But the place where he led him was so gloomy that on the way the boy even changed his mind for a second, although there was no turning back. As a result, he found himself chained to the altar of a dark magician, and they wanted to do something terrible to this child. Along with his father, a dark being towered over the boy, wanting to make a monster out of him by infusing his body with mutant blood. When Edward's mother found out about this, the woman could not allow her husband to do this, and was ready to strangle him with her own hands. Rushing to her son, she tried to pull out the vessels through which the monster's blood flowed into the boy's body. But as soon as she tried to do this, her husband appeared behind her, and in a second he deprived her of both hope and life. He killed her for the betrayal of the demon god that she dared to commit and believed that for such an offense, she deserved to die. The unfortunate woman collapsed right on top of her son's body, realizing that she had done everything in her power for the boy. Edward burst into tears, realizing that his father himself had turned out to be the evil monster he had dreamed of fighting. And now he found himself again in exactly the same position, knowing full well how this terrible experiment would end. But this time he suddenly shouted loudly that he did not want to end his life like his stupid mother and was not a traitor worthy of death. The guy shouted at the top of his lungs that all these past years he had been trying for the common cause of the Dark Clan and wanted to become a leader, dedicating his life to their cause. Realizing that this was his last chance, the father loudly demanded that his son not stop and say everything, hoping to save his life. At that moment, the guy admitted that that brilliant young alchemist was much stronger than they thought, and without his help, they would not defeat Henry. He was ready to admit all his mistakes if he was given one last chance to fix everything, because his faith in the demon god never faded for a second. But the demon declared that his stupidity had already led to terrible consequences that could not be corrected. The father said that the boy had already tried his best for the sake of the clan, and did not understand why the demon did not leave the boy a single chance. In response, he explained that Henry had already managed to remove part of the curse from the fire mistress, who had beheaded his brother 100 years ago. Since things had gone this far, Edward offered to speed up the search for the sword, and was ready to personally take control of the matter. Besides, he had influential friends in his circle who could help him if the demon did believe him. For some time the creature silently listened to the guy, who all this time was trying to prove his right to life. His father also fell silent, awaiting the decision of the being on whom his son's life depended. Finally, putting forward his black hand, the demon decided to give the guy one more chance and trust Edward one last time. Then the boy felt life returning to his body and was ready to endure this pain in order to carry out the leader's order. After it was all over, the guy breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that this time he wouldn't lose face. Finally, the demon warned that the guy had little time, so he should plan each day and do only this thing. In response, he stated that he would do it right now and did not intend to waste a minute. Moving away from the dark altar, Edward spent some time trying to come to his senses and understand what had happened. He then pulled out his mother's bracelet from his pocket, which was the only memory of his lost loved one. Now his main task was to find the sacred blade that Henry had kept for a long time, because with its help he would be able to carry out his plan. Clutching the broken half of the bracelet tightly in his fist, he vowed that soon he would have the strength to fight his father and defeat the entire clan. Then, smiling broadly, he realized that in the whole world he alone was worthy of being the savior of humanity, for this role was destined for him. Meanwhile, Henry remained in the place where the most fierce battle of his life had recently taken place. He held in his hands the very same award that Michelle had recently allowed him to take from the treasury as a sign of victory in the tournament. Henry suddenly declared that he knew where to look for the relic, and that it was probably at the bottom of a river in one of the provinces of the empire. By the way, he had already tried to get to the bottom once in the past, but that day he wanted to commit suicide. This happened right after he lost Sophia, who had always been the closest person in the world to him. In addition, he was the only survivor of that massacre, and after the invasion, many believed that he escaped and therefore remained alive. And at the moment when he was seeing Sophia off on her final journey, standing over her coffin, the guy continued to listen to insults from all sides. The father tried his best to protect Henry's name, realizing that the boy had also suffered, and only miraculously survived. The man felt ill from everything he had experienced, and it all eventually led to a heart attack. Clutching his heart, he stood like that for a while, and his wife, who had long noticed her husband's health problems, thought the worst. He soon collapsed to the floor, and only the quick arrival of an ambulance allowed him to stay alive for a while. That same evening, he was already lying in a hospital bed, and it became clear that the man needed urgent, expensive surgery. But the father decided to give the money that he had saved for the operation to his son, so that he could enter the faculty of cultivators. It was unclear why he had done this stupid thing, since his health was more important, and his studies could not force Henry to take this money. At some point, the guy realized that everything happened precisely because he failed to prevent the invasion of monsters, although at the beginning, he had a chance. The next day, he was already looking down from the ledge of a steep cliff, and below was the abyss of the river, in which he wanted to find himself. It is difficult to imagine what he was thinking before his death, because the guy was sure that jumping off the cliff would be the end of his story. Then, plucking up his courage, he stepped forward and flew straight to where his life was supposed to end. He hit the water hard and a wave rose from the place where he fell, because the jump took place from such a height that there was almost no chance of survival. For a while, the guy lost consciousness, and his body slowly sank to the bottom of the reservoir. There was no doubt what his step had led to. But suddenly, in this cold darkness, someone asked Henry to open his eyes. It was as if an inner voice spoke to him about the impending threat, and that only he was capable of stopping it and saving humanity. Suddenly, he actually opened his eyes right under the water, realizing that the voice calling him was all too familiar. Finding himself at the very bottom, he saw below him the settlement he had once visited before. The door of the house suddenly opened by itself, and a bright yellow light poured out, calling the guy inside. At that moment, Henry did not yet understand where this story would lead, but he was sure that he had to enter the house and understand what God wanted from him. Just a minute ago, he stood on the edge of the ledge and resigned himself to the fact that he was unworthy of living and walking on this earth. But the voice spoke louder and louder, and stretching out his hand forward, the guy tried to find himself on the threshold of this house. Soon the light became brighter, and Henry realized that he would find himself in the place where he was destined to learn the whole truth of the universe. Without understanding how, the guy found himself in the center of the Hall of Heroic Souls, inside of which stood 7 tall pillars. And above him towered the Yellow Emperor, the ruler of all people, who, having heard the boy's thoughts, decided to respond to his call. He wanted to honor Henry with the title of Emperor, so that the boy could join forces with the ruler and stop the mutant invasion. This is what Henry wanted more than anything in the world, because now he had a second chance to change everything. Then, filled with guilt and hatred, he lived and trained at the temple, improving his magical abilities every day. In order to defeat the Dark Clan, Henry decided to close himself off from the world and ended up becoming a real murder weapon. And one day, a girl entered the temple, who became his main mentor, but whose life he was never able to save. The Empress reported that hundreds of demons had attacked the western part of the empire, and that the entire numerous army had been destroyed. This task was easy for the guy who had learned a lot during his training, so he promised to quickly cope with the problem. But the Empress knew that he was only busy with meditation and magic, so she decided to ask him one question at the end. She wanted to know the truth, whether the guy was interested in state affairs and the position of the emperor, or whether she had disturbed him in vain. Unexpectedly, in response, the guy asked a counter-question about how much time would be needed to destroy the race if the head of the Dark Clan attacked. Then, turning sharply to her, he declared that it would take at least 3 years, but he did not have that much time.